Good morning, dearest friends. It's Monday. It's already April 4th. And the 3rd of Nisan, which means Pesach is rapidly approaching, but that's not what's on our mind today. What's on our mind is our journey through the entire Talmud, one page, one line, letters at a time. And we closed out on chapter 14 last time we met, which was on Friday. And B'Shah Tova B'Tzlachas, with gratitude to Hashem and gratitude to the dear, committed scholars and integral members of the Chabura, we are now entering chapter 15, the 15th chapter of Maseches Shabbos, entitled Ve'elu Ksharim. Ve'elu Ksharim. And as we pointed out a number of times, we are on the march, reviewing, covering, and honing in each of the 39 melachos of Shabbos. And in our previous discussions of the Mishnah and the Gemara, we talked about Kabbalah, injuring, killing, as well as different parts of the medical remedy and creating salt water or brine that's related to tanning, as we discussed, among other issues. And now we're going to go to an important, well-known melacha, and it's also highly relatable because it's something that we do in the course of life, which is tying and untying knots. Tying and untying knots is a melacha. Kosher and matir are melachos, prohibited activities or restricted activities on Shabbos. And so we're going to review if there are different types of knots, different conditions, some that we are familiar with because we use knots in modern day living. Most famously, I would say tying a shoelace, tying a tie. If you're a boater, we use knots or a sailor, I should say, we use knots in that process. If you interact with livestock, as we'll see in the Mishnah, those are the first items that come up. There are knots that are employed, and then I guess there are other. If anyone is involved in the fabric, what we shouldn't call shmata industry, but if you're weaving or whatever, so there's a whole different. There's a variety of ways that we might come in contact with this melacha, and tzitzis, and so that's going to be the discussion, our discussion. Now, being that we have many very relatable and personal experiences revolving around tying, it's natural that we're going to have a lot of practical questions. I would suggest that we endeavor to first cover a bit of ground and gain as much information about the Talmud's perspective of tying and untying in the abstract before trying to bring it home to the personal and the practical, just so that we'll have as much information as possible, and then we'll be able to tackle our practical experiences and our practical questions in a more educated and comprehensive way. And with that, let's share the screen, and we'll begin chapter 15, Perek Ve'elu Ksharim, the subject of tying knots on Shabbos. And again, I think we'll find this discussion interesting and relatable and practical. And here we are. Or almost are. So here we had that was the previous parak, and here we are. Ve'elu Ksharim. For our convenience, I pulled up some pictures, so we'll have some drawings as well for our accommodation. I hope you can see them, and if you can't, you'll please let me know once we get up to there. Ve'elu Ksharim. So as usual, the Mishnah starts off with the assumption that we already know that we don't tie knots on Shabbos, and indeed we know, because we read in a Mishnah that listed all the melachos, and it included that melacha. So here we go. Ve'elu Ksharim shechayavim aleihem. These are the knots that one is chayiv. Hold on. All right. The following are knots that one would be liable on Shabbos. Let's read Rashi. When we have a Mishnah that enumerates 39 malachis, including tying and untying. Here are the knots that are included in that prohibition. The katani, as we read in the Mishnah, hakoisher v'hamatir, a person who ties and unties, but the Mishnah didn't stop there. It added the words kesher shel kayama. We're talking about a kesher shel kayama, a lasting, enduring knot, which is not untied forever. Dumya de koishrei chutei yeriyos haniv sakai. Similar to the way that in the Mishkan they tied, if a string snapped, it was tied together to keep the Mishkan whole. And so the Rashi is asserting that we had a use for knotting in the Mishkan, and those knots were long-term, enduring, permanent knots. I think the permanent is the correct word here, a permanent knot.
I wonder what is the meaning of the term permanent, because the next we are going to learn first that there are so-called unpermanent ties, and second that the permanent ties can be untied. So what is the value of the unpermanent and how it's different from what?
So this question is going to drive a number of the discussions that are going to unfold. What does it mean permanent? As the professor, as you pointed out, permanent could be it's not able to be untied, or it could mean that you don't intend to untie it. Typically, once you make that knot, it is meant to be permanent. And Rashi takes the position that we're talking about threads that came loose or snapped and they're tied in the curtains of the Mishkan. And of course, Rashi needs to make that assertion because all the malachas that are enumerated exist in the Mishkan. And so if we would not find the use of this kind of knot, then it wouldn't be a malacha.
Rabbi?
Yes, doctor. Yes, doctor.
The two examples of a camel's driver's knot and a sailor's knot, to me, immediately come to mind something that is exactly the opposite of being permanent.
Right. So let's see. Rashi is giving us the building blocks, but I agree with you.
Right.
We're going to spend some time trying to define them, and we'll use some pictures. And I want to say in the outset, knotting is another area that I don't have a specific expertise, and I never even went to what do we call it, to the scouts. I was never a scout, and so I'm probably lacking in I'm doubly lacking in my knotting expertise. And so I'm going to, as always, try to defer to the experience and the expertise of the members of our Chabura to try to, have a deeper and better understanding of this Gemara. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
you know not what you missed.
Doctor, full points.
Okay.
Reb Beryl, I'm a little disappointed you didn't. All right. So again, Rashi tells us that the way we had these knots in the Mishkan was in repairing the Mishkan.
Rabbi.
Yes, Reb Beryl.
The only thing that I have difficulty with is the word permanent from the person. I could tie a knot which I can't untie, but somebody else could. So correct. What I was thinking.
We haven't really discussed the definition. We've just thrown out an idea that Rashi enumerated. But really, as you may recall, the Mishnah. Let's do this. Who remembers where that Mishnah was? Bear with me just a moment. We're going to pull up that Mishnah, so we'll have it. Hang on, just bear with me a moment. Was this it? No. All right, we might give up for the moment. All right. Anyways, suffice it to say, Rashi gave us a little bit of an elaboration. He says that it is she'enoi matira la'olam. The intention is not to untie it, right? You notice that? She'enoi matira. If you're creating a curtain, most likely in the Mishkan, you're not going to be untying it. But let's now see the specific instances the Mishnah gives, so we can continue our exploration. Kasher hagimolim. The knot that the knot used for camels, as we'll discuss soon. The kesher has upon him and a sailor's knot. These are examples of knots that are prohibited biblically due to their permanence. Now, we're going to have our first clue to the definition of permanent, which is here. Just as a person is chayiv for tying these knots, similarly, one is chayiv for untying. Rashi, as we learned in the Gemara in Perek Klal Gadol, we mentioned there that those who trapped the chilazon, which we'll call a snail that had provided the pigments for techelas, so the Gemara there told us that occasionally these nets would need to be tightened, loosened, expanded, or contracted, and in order to manipulate or adjust the size of those nets, tying and untying was necessary. And as far as the question of are these knots that are not possible to be untied, I think we have our clue that that's not what we mean when we say permanent, because if it was not able to be untied, we wouldn't mention untying it. Rashi.
So if you make a mistake and you tie a knot, you realize it's Shabbos, you're better off not to untie it. You'd have to bring two korbanos.
Correct. Or most likely. Most likely. Just like you shouldn't flip, if you know, many of us probably have experienced this because we're humans. You wake up in the middle of the night and you don't know where you are or what day it is, and you walk into the bathroom and you flip the light on because that's what your arm memory or whatever your muscle memory tells you to do. And then all of a sudden your mind sends you a message, hold on, it's Shabbos. And before you even give a thought, your hand instinctively, you might have flipped the switch down. This wasn't because you consciously said, hey, let me do another malacha. It's just like you didn't mean to do it, and it's manifest in your behavior. That's how I understand it. Dr. Emmer, if you have a different interpretation, I'll defer to your expertise. But
I was thinking in terms of the knots, the camel and the sailor. If you look at it and focus on Shabbos, the idea is if you, when you do it, you obviously shouldn't do it on Shabbos. You should do it before Shabbos. But the intention is that it be permanent, meaning that throughout Shabbos, you're not going to be touching these knots. That's, that I just thought of that's one way of making sense out of right. What I didn't think.
So the Gemara too is going to try to identify what these knots are, because of your very question, aren't there certain knots that are very temporary? So let's finish the Mishnah, and then we'll see the Gemara, and hopefully we'll have a little more clarity. Rabbi Meir Omer. So point one of our Mishnah is the Mishnah that mentions 39 malachis, including tying and untying a permanent knot. It's describing a knot, for example, that we use on a camel or on a sailor's knot. What that knot looks like, we don't know yet. Rabbi Meir chimes in with the halacha. Kol kesher shu yochel lahatirai v'achas miyadav. A knot that's so loose or so simple that it can be undone with even with one hand. Ein chayavin alav. This is not a kind of knot that one is liable for tying or untying. Rashi ein chayavan alav afilu asay lekayama. So an incredibly loose knot, one would not be, or an incredibly easy to undo knot, one would be potter. This too, the Gemara is going to discuss. Does it include, for example, a bow, where with one hand you can undo it, but for the duration of its knot, it's fairly solid? So this is the Mishnah that we are going to be discussing in the Gemara. All right, let's see the Gemara. Gemara asks a question, and based on Dr. Hammer's comments, the question is actually well understood. My kesher hagemolim v'kesher hasapanim. What do we mean when we say that we're talking? What do we mean when the Mishnah says a camel knot and a sailor's knot? Ilema kitra dikatri bizmama. If you say we're talking about a knot, remember this. Kitra in this context means kesher, and the tests here on the shin, just between Aramaic and English, are somewhat interchangeable. So just a good word for our Talmud vocabulary. Ilema kitra dikatri bizmama. If we're talking about the knot that's tied in the zmama, Rashi. Okay, in the nose ring of the camel, Rashi zeo kesher haritzois shekoishrim betabas. This is describing the knot that we tie the reins of the camel to a ring in its nose. Hai kesher she'ene shel kayamahu. This is a knot that is not permanent at all. Elokitra. This mama gufe, what we're the Gemara says, what are we describing? When the Mishnah talks about a knot in a camel that's permanent, we're talking about the knot that fastens the ring itself to the camel's nose, the ischarida gufe, and the ship's ring itself. In other words, the camel has a permanent installation in its nose ring, and I believe so. Although it's been a while since I saw camels. We'll see some pictures in a moment. And the actual ring may have had a knot which is a permanent nature. What's attached to that, to the reins, or what's attached to that, maybe it's not a rein, but to secure the camel while you're resting, that is very not permanent. It's done and undone. And similarly, the boat has the knot that you're constantly tying and untying when you're coming to a dock or into a port. That's highly temporary. But the knot that fastens the rope on the other end to the boat, that's going to be quite permanent. Rashi, let's read Rashi, then we'll look at some pictures. Hold on, just give me a second. Zeu akesher, here, Istrida, sorry. Gam hu kimintabas, sha'oisa min akal oimin ritzua benekev sheberoish hasfina. This knot, too, is a knot that we're talking about that's tied to a some kind of ring or I don't know how the right words here, part of the boat. This knot indoors. And then upon that ring, there's a done and undone ring. But Kitra, the Katra Bastrida, Kesher Ritzua Harucha. Let's take a look at some pictures to gain.
Rabbi.
Yes, Rabbi.
Rabbi, it's very true to the situation, because a boat, what normally happens, there's a metal thing and then you just loop a rope around it, which is similar to what they're talking about, the nose of the camel. I don't know, does that qualify as a knot or not? Maybe that's the question. You know, they just loop the rope around and then it holds based on that metal thing that's on the dock.
So these pictures here, take it or leave it, are portraying for us the way there's the item that is more permanently, there's a loop that's more permanently fastened, and then that itself is used to attach to a post or to a person's hand or whatever. And similarly to the boat, there's the rope that's permanently used, but that itself is extended to fasten to something else.
Are you trying to show the pictures? Because we don't see anything.
Did you see it before?
Nothing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So I need to
You have
change.
to untie us.
Okay, bear with me. Now let's do this again. So I'm sharing now my screen. Oh, so you didn't see the pictures that I was showing you?
No.
All right, I'm sorry. Here we go. Again, I don't know if this is going to help you much, but here you have the rope that's permanently anchored onto the boat. And then that rope you throw over and wrap around or tie, as Roberto pointed out, when you come into port. And similarly here, the camel's nose, you have a permanent loop through the nose. And then that string could be anchored or tied. And so that appears to be what we're describing as a permanent knot. Now, we're not done yet. We're not entirely done yet with the discussion of camels nor ships. Generally speaking, the principle that we use to say is that a permanent knot is a double knot. I'm sure you've heard that. And an impermanent knot perhaps is a single knot. Rabbi Steinsaltz points out over here, just to give us a little flavor. There's a big machloikes if these two examples are exclusive. Are those the exclusive instances of prohibited knots? Or if those are examples that inform us about other kinds of knots. So in the words of Rabbi Steinsaltz, according to Rashi, these are only examples. The Torah prohibits any permanent knot, in case you're wondering exactly what we said over here. In Rashi on the Mishnah, right? He says that if it's permanent, if it's a kesher shel kayam, it's prohibited. The Rambam and others paskin, no. One is only chayiv midoraisa if it was a camel knot or a sailor's knot. Let's do a fast Google. It's not what I was looking for, but interesting. How to tie a camel's hitch. Okay, apparently it's a thing. Let's see if the images. All right, I think we need to take off from the word ring. The word ring is confusing Google.
Rabbi, why are we concentrating on the knot? A person doesn't tie a knot because he's playing a game. He has a reason for tying that knot. We should be looking more at why is he tying it, no?
No, first we have to look at the essential definition of the prohibited activity. Google's not being helpful today, I'm sorry. And so the essential prohibited activity is what it is. It's a certain kind of knot. After that, we always have the discussion of kavana, intent, whatever, but that's not the first question. The first question is, what is the behavior that the Mishnah is prohibiting? Because ultimately, there is a precise definition of the prohibited knot that we alluded to in the Mishnah, the kesher shel kayama.
Yeah, but Rabbi, the knots, wherever they occurred in the Mishkan, were there to hold something, attach something, etc., etc. And we don't mention anything about that here except the knot itself.
Well, first of all, I did mention, and Rashi mentioned that it was what the knot was, but that's not the exclusive event where a knot is prohibited. We, according to Rashi at least, the Rambam will learn this differently. We learn from the nature of a knot in the Mishkan to tell us what kind of knots are prohibited. Namely, if you're making a repair on the tapestries of the Mishkan, well, those are permanent. And therefore, we can infer from there that a knot that is intended to be permanent, that is the prohibited knot. That's certainly how Rashi is learning it. Again, we just pointed out the Rambam might learn differently. Now, I do want to add one other detail, which is that the Rashi tells us that the source of knots in the Mishkan was the repairs that were done. The Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is not the Talmud we are studying, but it's always important. It's if we have access to resources that can help us contrast the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. So, for example, here we have Rabbi Steinsaltz making this point, and I think the Mesivta will bring it to our attention as well. Points out that according to the Gemara Yerushalmi, there are different opinions where knots were used in the Mishkan. Possibly the pegs that we discussed that anchored the ropes that helped fasten the courtyard, they may have been permanently attached. Alternatively, we're talking about, we'll actually hear what Rashi says, the fixing the fabrics of the Mishkan. So anyways, the Gemara here explains that although we use the word a camel's knot, not any camel's knot is the problem. We're talking about the permanent side of the business. Not.
I apologize for leaving.
Carol, have a wonderful day. Shkoyach. The Gemara continues. Rabbi Meir Omer Kol Kasher. So the Mishnah says that Rabbi Meir taught that a knot that can be undone with one hand is a loose knot that can be tied or untied. Rabbi Meir Omer Kol Kasher. So you have an interesting question. Boy, Rav Achtavei, the brother of Maracha, asked, what about a bow? Aniva l'Rabbi Meir mahu. What is the halacha with an aniva? Rashi, are you allowed to make a bow? Tamei Rabbi Meir. So let's try to dig deep into the machshava, the thoughts of Rabbi Meir, the sevara of Rabbi Meir. Do we say mishum diyachal hatir biyachas miyadavu v'hanam yachal hatir? Is the primary issue the ability to untie with one hand? Alternatively, maybe Rabbi Meir was saying mishum deloy mihadak. It actually doesn't fasten. It doesn't attach. It really doesn't stay together at all. The high ha mihad mihadak. A bow ultimately is tightly, securely fastened. And the Gemara here concludes, Teku, Tishpi Yitorats, Kushyois V'Yiboyos. The halacha has to stand. We don't know. Are you allowed to do a bow? Says this Gemara, because it's tight. I'm sorry, are you not allowed to do it because it's tight, or are you allowed to do it because you can do it with one hand? I know the question you're all wondering, but let's hold off on it. Your question that you're wondering is, so Tachlis, why today are we so lenient about making bows? So let's hold off for a little more study of the Gemara, and with Hashem's help, we'll address that in due time. So stand by for some more Gemara. So this is the first Mishnah of our new chapter, Eluk Sharim, in which we learn that permanent knots of a camel, a sailor, are prohibited, and a knot that can be easily undone with one hand. It may be tied on Shabbos because we don't really look at it as a knot at all in the halachic perspective. Ultimately, as Tosfos points out, the Gemara later on is going to continue this discussion, and that's why we're not going to. Well, actually, hold on one second. Let's just see one thing. Should we do this? Should we jump ahead? Take a look at the Rambam. It might confuse us, but it might also be good for as a resource going forward. The words of the Rambam. We're gonna have to try to forget what the Rambam says afterwards, but it's good to see. If you tie a knot that's indoors and it's done in a professional way. For example, a camel or sailor, which are both professional industries. The or then the knots that the shoemaker employs, those are prohibited. But if you make the knot permanent, but you are just a layperson, you are potter, you are biblically exempt. All right, let's see, because actually we probably should look at the next Mishnah, which makes a similar point. So here we go. Any comments or thoughts? More in the understanding the Mishnah and the Gemara, less on other halachic questions. Doctor? All right. Here we go. Next Mishnah. Yesh lecha ksharim she'ein chayav maleihem. There are additional types of knots that one is not chayiv for. Rashi, chatos, kimoisha chayav mal kesher hagamolim, ela potter aval aser. One is potter, but aser. Potter means you're not biblically on the hook. Aser means rabbinically you shouldn't do it. The Gemara mefarish hayninhu, and the Gemara is going to explain which kind of knots are we talking about. There are knots that you are not chayiv for, the way you're chayiv for a camel or a sailor's knot. That's a tentative interpretation of the Mishnah. What are those instances? You shouldn't do it, but it is not a biblical prohibition. A woman may tie, miftach haluka, a knot to close her garment, her cloak. B'chute sevacha. Similarly, they may tie the knots that close the sevacha, which I think we had before, but Rabbi Steinsaltz here translates the hairnet. Bishel pasikya, you may tie, or all right, let's read it, then we'll see. You can tie the pasikya, the girdle, or tzuos minol v'sandal, and the straps of a shoe or a sandal. B'noides yain v'shemen, and flasks of wine and oil, ukadeir shel basar, and a pot of meat. So again, we have knots that you're not chayiv for. We didn't specify which. Then we said that you're allowed to tie the following: clothing for a woman, different kinds of clothing, food-related knots. B'Elazar b'Yaakov adds, you're also allowed to tie, to lock in, to close in the animal from escaping. Let's read some Rashis here. Mafteach haluka, k'moy sheyesh. Very interesting. I hope I'm understanding this Rashi correctly. K'moy sheyesh legalachim, ke'ein l'shoynais lakan lakan. The way, anyone know what a galach is? Priest. I think that's what he's saying. The way the priests of his era have these kind of straps that come to both sides, v'koshim shal yamin b'kasav small, and you tie the right one over onto the left shoulder, v'shal small b'kasav yamin. The chivon dechol yoyma sharule, being that a person, a woman, unties her clothing every day to get in and out of it. Laidami midi the kesher shel chayama mutar lechatchila. It's not akin to a permanent knot, and therefore it is permissible. Today, I think a lot of what we're describing might be done with buckles, where the strap will go through a loop or something to that effect. Here we're talking about tying two sides of the garment together, and that is permitted. Permitted, yeah. Savacha, Rashi, Koifa, this is describing a hairnet. V'shel psakya. Ezer racha v'chutin tluim b'roishay l'koisha b'hen v'koidim pindos. We're talking also about a hair net, which is tied with bows or on both sides, right? Is that what we said, psakya? I don't know. Hold on. Yeah, hairnet. Psakya, we said, is bands, shoulder straps. Okay, so maybe this is what we call the girdle. Okay. Similarly, apparently, noides yayin shel ar, they had leather that would be bound together, and you tie them. Keder shel basar, sometimes they would use a material to close up the pot. You put a rope across the entranceway. So our Mishnah apparently is expanding I don't know why we're having issues loading. Bear with me. Oh, here we are. So our Mishnah points out that there are certain knots that are biblically permitted and rabbinically prohibited, and then a number of knots that are lechatchila permitted, such as all the enumerated items. Let's see the Gemara. Hagufa Kasha, the Gemara says, hold on, there's something wrong here. This is a Mishnah that is a challenging Mishnah to comprehend. Amras yesh ksharim she'ein chayavim aleihem ki kesher hagemalim u kesher hasaponim. You mention, the Mishnah mentions, that there are certain knots that one is not in as hot water or as much hot water as the gamolim, the knots of the camel drivers and the sailors, meaning that you are biblically allowed and rabbinically prohibited. Meaning that you're not chayiv midiraisa, ha'isura ika, but you are yet prohibited. The Mishnah doesn't mention which kinds of knots. The Hadar Tani, the Mishnah goes on to say koisheres. The next list of items are koisheres. You should tie. You are permitted to do so. The word koisheres indicates koisher isha miftach halukah. A woman is allowed to tie her clothing. Afilu lechatchila. This is lechatchila. You should do so. So is the Mishnah going to tell us knots that you're not allowed to tie? Or is the Mishnah just teasing us? What's going on? So the Gemara explains, Hachi Kamar. This is how to decipher. Here is how to understand our Mishnah. Yesh ksharim she'ein chayav maleim kikesher hagemalim or kikesher hasapanim. There are knots that you are not biblically prohibited, unlike the knots of the camel driver and the sailor. And what kind of knots are we talking about? Kitre the Katre Bizmama, the Kitre the Katre Beistrada. We're describing the other two knots that the Gemara initially said is what we're not talking about. So I'm sorry, there are two types of knots that a sailor might use, and there are two types of knots that a camel driver might use. There is the permanent knot, and then there is the very strong and enduring but frequently done and undone knot. So the knot that one ties to the zamama, to the knot, to the thing that's affixed to the nose, and the knot that's attached to the ring of rope that's attached to the bow of the ship. Those are not biblically prohibited, but they are yet prohibited from being done midirabanan. Rashi, the long strap that is run through the loop in the nose. Also, the kosher, one shouldn't tie it. Sometimes it is left for a while. The kosher but I guess there's some very, very loose knots that can yet be done. So we're talking here about the knot that we said is not midaraisa, but it is derabanan. Again, a knot which one ties a strap to the camel's nose ring, and a knot which one ties to the rope, ties a rope to the ring fixed to the bow of the boat. These are only midirabanan. There is a third genre of knots that are totally permissible, and those are kesheres miftachei chaluka, the garments of the knots that are involved in the wearing of apparel. So what did the Gemara just establish? The Gemara established that thus far we have three types of knots: biblically prohibited, rabbinically prohibited, and mutar lechatchila. That is what our Gemara has accomplished thus far. The Gemara continues. You might like this Gemara. Miftach halukah. The Mishnah says a woman is allowed to tie clothes. She's allowed to shut her clothing. Shita, the Gemara asked the question that we're wondering. Are you trying to tell me that there was a savara that we're not going to allow people to wear their clothing? Obviously, a person is allowed to wear clothing, and also obviously, clothing is something that is pretty much put on and taken off on a daily basis. The Gemara says no. There is a chiddush here. Isla Trey Dashi. What if the garment has two openings? Rashi. Shnei psachim. Haino oison l'shoinais. V'havyan zula ma'ila v'zula mata. Zula yimim v'zula small. V'me'ena materes ala echad. Yichoi l'poishel lev shabodaychik. We described a crisscrossing straps that secure the garment. But if you only untie one strap, let's say, or half the straps, the garment will be loose enough that you could technically remove it. So we say, Mahu detema chada minayu batuli mevatala. Maybe one knot makes the garment undone, and the other garment is permanent. Rashi v'tave kesher shel kayama, because you don't need to undo it. And being that either one might be left on permanently, we'll say the whole garment is prohibited. Kamashmalan, the Gemara teaches us what is a slight chiddush. You might have thought you shouldn't undo it. The Gemara answers, of course you can undo it. Of course you can wear your clothing as you do. So that's the chiddush. That's why the Mishnah needs to enumerate it. Because technically, again, to recap, technically you could take off only one. You could untie only one half or one side, and you'd still be able to slip out of the clothing. And therefore, there's a concern that one of the knots will become permanent in that they're not going to be undone. Kamash Malon, this is entirely acceptable. You're allowed to put on, take off, and tie your clothing in case you had any concern.
Rabbi,
yes, doctor.
It's very possible and easy to design clothing that doesn't need anything that has to be tied.
Correct. I think now we're describing a prevalent clothing design of that era. So it's not so much that we can't find a workaround.
Right.
But we're addressing the reality of the day. Now, I should add that Rabbi Steinsaltz explains this a little differently. Or I don't know if it's differently. At least he shows a picture that's different than the way I understood it. I may have understood it wrong. I just was reading Rashi. Rabbi Steinsaltz shows what was the forerunner of buttons. Before you had buttons, you had laces, and you might have had a lace here and a lace here. And just like a shirt or a polo shirt, if you unbutton one button, you could remove possibly, you don't have to unbutton all the buttons. You could slip out of it. So the picture that Rabbi Steinsaltz shows is that there's two laces, one higher up and one lower down. And so maybe you could slip off the garment as long as the upper one is undone. Maybe the bottom one is more permanent. And so that would be another way to understand the Gemara. I might think you could slip off the garment with only opening the top button or untying the top knot being that you could technically leave the lower one on. Maybe it'll become permanent. Kamash Malon, you're allowed to put on your clothing. Now you'll ask another question. Why do we say Isha? So I understood it because that's what women's apparel was like. And that's what Rashi indicates. It doesn't seem to that men's garments was like that. The picture that Rabbi Steinsaltz provides is probably an apparel that was worn by men and women alike, which probably is the reason why Rashi wouldn't provide that explanation, because we need to find a scenario, an instance where the garment was more prevalent more in the Ezras Nashim than on the men's apparel. Yes, doctor.
So I have a question. The public tying that we see every Shabbos has to do with Sefer Torah, and the question is that's a knot of sort. It could be. Are you bow.
Describing if the gartel or the mantle has a bow or which many shirts have?
Right. That's number one that I want to raise. That's an interesting issue of tying a knot or a bow, but more what came to mind has to do with Velcro. It's amazing that that's accepted to me when I know another things that I have Velcro, how often it tears off something after a while. You have a jacket that you wear outside that the sleeves go with Velcro, and all of a sudden you put it off, and we do it in shul with Velcro also.
Right. So you're saying is Velcro?
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, Velcro has the functional contribution of a knot or tying.
Right.
It doesn't actually have the melacha side of it, but it's an interesting question because really what Velcro is, I think, is a series of little little.
It's a little Lego puzzle made out of.
Yeah. Actually, I got to say, whoever invented Velcro, that's quite a brilliant.
Yeah.
Quite a brilliant feat.
Great for kids who have to learn before they learn how to tie a bow on their shoe.
Yeah.
What happened before?
Listen, today many shoes are loafers without laces at all.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's do one more little segment of the Gemara, and then we will tomorrow, Bli Neder, we will talk about shoes and hopefully shoelaces and other such discussions. So tomorrow's Gemara is going to be the Gemara that will hopefully be extremely relevant or relatable. Here we go. Chutei Savacha, the strings of the hairnet. Shita the Gemara says, and Rashi points out, Kol Yom HaSharilei, a person every day takes off their hairnet. If you take it off every day, Rashi explains, obviously it's not a permanent knot, because remember, Rashi, the whole question is, Tachlis, is it permanent or not? We'd have to go back and relearn the Gemara with the Rambam's lenses and see how he learns the Gemara, but right now we're sticking with Rashi. Maybe we're talking about that it's kind of loose. Rashi, it's not tightly affixed to her head. She makes it loose. You could slip it off your head while it is still tied. So being that you can functionally remove it without great duress, and you might reasonably leave it tied. Maybe you'll slip it off, and then it'll remain a knot that's permanent. Rashi Miroisha, Kamash Malon, Chasa al Saara, Umishra Sha'yale. Most people are mindful both of their comfort, mindful of their hair, mindful of the net, and therefore the odds are they're going to untie it. Rashi, Shema Toitzi B'doichek, V'tinosek Sara V'depaske Nami. Basically, people are mindful of their clothing. People are mindful of optimum modesty, and therefore we assume most people are going to handle the garments and handle these knots in the way that the garment is designed, and therefore there is no concern for the purposes of Shabbos that a person will come to have a permanent knot. This is, again, we're in the second Mishnah. We explained the general confusion of the Mishnah. What are the items that are biblically allowed and rabbinically prohibited? And then we discussed the chiddush of a woman's cloak. We discussed the chiddush of a hairnet that may be untied. We're not afraid of a permanent knot. And tomorrow, with Hashem's help, we'll analyze the next Gemara, which talks about ritzuas minal v'sandal, straps of a shoe or a sandal on Shabbos. We'll talk about shoelaces and sandals, etc. Why don't we pause right over here? I want to tell you a nice thing that happened yesterday. I mean, this is not going to be such a surprising story to hear from a Chabadnik, but I got a message yesterday from a young man who was on the boardwalk, and he said, I met a Jew, and he's been living there, and he seems very detached from his Yiddishkeit. He doesn't have a mezuzah. Maybe you could run over. And knowing how busy this time of year is, I turned to my wife. I said, listen, either I go now, or this guy's going to probably fall through the cracks till after Pesach, and he might change his mind. So I ran over there, and I brought him a mezuzah. We put up the mezuzah. He was so excited. And then I asked him if he wants to put on tefillin. He got all emotional. So I said, have you ever put on tefillin before? He said, sure, I did. And he says, I put him on 50 years ago at my bar mitzvah. Never since. And so he was very excited to be able to put on tefillin the first time in 50 years since his bar mitzvah. And it was beautiful to see a Yiddish neshama come alive, someone who for 50 years it was on mute, but he, on his own, engaged this other person in a conversation and was eager to have the opportunity to put up a mezuzah, to put on tefillin. With Hashem's help, I hope we'll schlep him more and more to the community, but it was a nice thing that just happened, so I wanted to share that with you. My dear friends, we didn't say it at the end, but of course we dedicate our learning for the good health, well-being of our dear members of our Chabura and their households. Mention Malka Bas Rivka, Leah Bas Rita, and all of Klal Yisrael for good news. Our world needs a heavy dose. In Eretz Yisrael, we daven that there should be only good news and healthy news and safe news. And Mark, we're proud to have you there representing us. and we should only have good news for all of Klal Yisrael. Hoping to see everyone tomorrow for a discussion about how to tie your shoes. Shkoyach.
Yeah. I'll see you on Wednesday. I can't make it tomorrow.
All right, we'll miss you tomorrow. Shkoyach.